Through years of lonely vigil kept, to look for me, they never came. None ever searched or even wept. Nobody stayed to speak my name.
Until that summer day I heard some voices soft and stained with tears. Then I knew they had come to roll away those wasted years.
Their hearts felt out to hold me, made me whole like other men, but they had come just me to see, drawing me back home with them.
Now I am at peace and free to roam, where here my family speak my name. That day my soul was called back home, for on that day my family came.
The scale of the First World War was astonishing. Some 65 million men took up arms, and of those, 37.5 million were killed, wounded, missing, or taken prisoner.
This now beautiful street in famous Paddington, just 3 kilometres away from our school, was once a slum. Yet this did nothing to damper its patriotism. Bent Street here in 1916 was just 30 houses. And of these 30 houses, 29 men enlisted to serve in the Great War.
Here on the streets in Paddington and all around the nation, everybody was behind the war. Pride painted the streets as nearly half of Australia's eligible men enlisted. Today, that's an equivalent to 2 million men volunteering to serve.
62,000 men died in the fighting, but this number significantly doubled within the next decade. This was due to wounds, illness, and unfortunately suicide.
As part of their history studies, students from Sydney's St Clare's College in Waverley created video profiles of missing diggers from the 1916 Battle of Fromelles in northern France. Over more than 2 years, the project expanded into a documentary film to honour the diggers and to view the conflict through the eyes of the families and loved ones who sent their men halfway around the world and never saw them again.
He wrote home to his mother and father, "France is a beautiful place, a regular paradise after the burning sands and heat of the Egyptian desert.
There is no reason whatever why I shouldn't go right through the ordeal and come back and see you all again."
He was my grandfather's older brother, and I've always just been really interested in him because my great-grandmother never really got over his death. He was supposed to be very talented and clever and just a really nice young man, and the family never really got over his not knowing what happened to him. They hoped that he had been kidnapped or captured and was alive somewhere, but they never really knew what happened to him. And even many years after the war, my great-grandfather was still writing letters trying to find out what had happened to him.
In 1915, at the age of 18, George was handed a white feather to symbolise cowardice while sitting in the church. This led to his enlistment into World War I on the 2nd of October.
The story I was told by my grandfather is that when he was at church he was handed a white feather, and I think there was a lot of pressure from some women that men should do their duty and join up, and so I think he felt like it was his duty, and if he didn't, people would think he was a coward. Yeah. He'd been such a bright student. I think he was supposed to have been Dux of Sydney Boys High, and he'd been the first one to go to university in our family, and my grandmother, she just really never got over the loss. Every year she'd put a little notice in the newspaper, my great-grandmother it is, remembering him. There's a lot of letters in the album, but this is the one that I find the most moving. It's the last letter that came from George before he went missing. So a letter from George to his mother on the 10th of July. "We are now under fire from the enemy just behind the trenches, and so far there have been no casualties. The time has come at last when we must one and all face the enemy, and may God help us for the sake of those we have left behind, for I know you will be most anxious, and I don't want you to worry. Dear Mother, keep praying and keep happy. It's no use being sad. There is too much sorrow in France. your loving son, George. That puts a lump in my throat every time I read it. And I feel like he's speaking to us from the grave. He's speaking for all young men everywhere that just sacrificed.
The Battle for Fromelles illustrates Australia's First World War losses, perhaps more than any other. It happened near a tiny hamlet in northeastern France over just 24 hours on the 19th of July, 1916.
When the First World War came to Fromelles, it had a population of about 1,000 people living in 200 houses. The railway had arrived in 1902 and electricity finally reached the main street the year before war broke out. As with countless villages and towns across France, Fromelles would be totally destroyed by war's end.
By the time the Australian forces had reached France, following the disastrous Gallipoli campaign, the fighting on what had become known as the Western Front in France and Belgium had degenerated into a muddy, bloody stalemate with hundreds of lives being sacrificed for every metre of ground gained.
The commanders from both sides faced an impossible problem because the front lines mirrored each other for 760 kilometres. Right across the continent, from the English Channel to the Swiss Alps, there were no edges or flanks.
If you can't outflank your enemy, you must attack them head-on. So, the conflict became a terrible war of attrition, as men and machinery were thrown against each other in ever-increasing numbers, and the casualties rose accordingly.
In mid-1916, the Allies tried to break the deadlock by launching a massive assault around the Somme River, north of Paris. It ended as an unthinkable disaster. On the opening day of the battle alone, the 1st of July 1916, the British suffered 57,000 casualties, including 19,000 killed.
To prevent the Germans from bringing reinforcements from northern France to the Somme, the Allies staged a diversionary attack, a fake attack, near the tiny village of Fromelles.
But as so often happens in the chaos of war, the planned fake attack somehow turned into a real one, without giving the Australians any time for proper planning, and the catastrophe of Fromelles was born.
Although the Australians of the 5th Division only reached the area days before the battle, they were thrown against the long-established German defences in broad daylight on a fine summer's evening at 6 p.m. on July 19, 1916.
Around 7,000 diggers, half of whom had already survived Gallipoli, charged across this ground, as flat as football fields, with no cover at all, right into the teeth of the German machine guns.
Here, on the right side of the Australian front line, no man's land was about 350 metres wide. The diggers had no chance. The Allies nicknamed this German position the Sugarloaf because it resembled a local loaf of bread. This was the deadliest place in Fromelles because it was full of machine gun nests.
On the other side of the Australian front line, no man's land was less than 100 metres wide, and it was here that the diggers broke through the German front lines.
Sadly, many of them died there when the Germans counterattacked, and most of them disappeared without trace for almost a century. They became the lost diggers of Fromelles.
During the nights and days after the battle, more diggers heroically lost their lives trying to recover their wounded and dead mates from no man's land under continuous fire.
As they added up the terrible casualty toll, the Australians realised that hundreds of their mates had simply disappeared off the face of the earth. Of the 7,000 diggers who attacked at Fromelles, 5,533 became casualties, with almost 2,000 of those killed, including 25 sets of brothers and a father and son, all within 24 hours.
Indeed, we lost more killed in Fromelles than we did in total in the Boer, Vietnam and Korean wars and every conflict since. To this day, it is the worst 24 hours in our history.
Australian diggers suffered proportionally more deaths, illnesses and wounds than the armies of Britain, Germany, the US, Canada or France.
The devastating losses from the war affected virtually every family in Australia. 1 in every 4 families lost a brother, a son or a husband. But in addition to the terrible losses, the story of Fromelles differs from many of the better-known battles from World War I because, more than a century after it occurred, it remains a living fragment of our history.
Of the almost 2,000 Australian dead at Fromelles, around 1,300 were declared missing, and their families were thrust into a terrible netherworld, not knowing how their loved ones had died, or even whether they had died at all.
Many mothers of the missing diggers left their veranda lights on for the rest of their lives, hoping that one day their sons would return home.
That's why we began our project, to keep the memories of the missing diggers of Fromelles alive, by creating lasting video portraits of them and looking at the impact that the battle and war in general had on the loved ones and the communities the diggers left behind.
It's hard to imagine it. Death, the dirt, agony. It's an entirely different universe. You spend so much time preparing to go to war and go through blood, sweat and tears to make sure you know exactly what's coming, but nothing can prepare you for it.
Edgar Williams worked for 60 hours after the 19th of July, bringing in wounded till he was sniped and blinded. We saw him but could not get at him.
I saw him blown to pieces by a bomb in a German trench at Fromelles on the morning of the 20th.
Herbert's mother leaves a special plaque resting on the opposing side of her headstone, keeping her son's memory alive.
Jack's mother Isa was known as a local poetess in her town. She wrote many poems and provided an emotional insight into how many families grieved death during the war. Cherished names in golden letters tell how heavy was the cost, on the long and bitter conflict that a cause might not be lost. At thy shrine in sad remembrance, every heart will hope and pray that the peace so dearly purchased, peace at last for aye.
I am still waiting. First missing, then prisoner of war, then killed in action.
I know he was not the only by thousands, but he was my son. Just lent to me for 35 years and then missing. I know a good son. I believe a good man. But I do not know if a good soldier. He has paid the price, as many others have done. But in all the world, there is not love like a mother's love for her children.
The family's grief and the lack of information about their loved ones continued for 90 years, until a retired Melbourne art teacher, Lambis and Glazos, began a remarkable detective quest.
As Lambis did his research on Fromelles, he realised the numbers of those known to have gone missing from the battle and those listed as being buried in the local cemeteries didn't add up.
There was that distinction to be made between missing and the unaccounted for missing. The numbers did not add up, and we'd seen the photograph of soldiers stacked high on the carts of a light rail being taken back somewhere behind their lines of burial, and we put forth the proposition that somewhere behind the German line there should be a burial site of our missing soldiers.
Lambis and a growing team of supporters from Australia and overseas began a decade-long quest. They relentlessly gathered evidence that ultimately forced the reluctant authorities to search the area where they believed the Germans had buried the missing diggers, behind a wood that the Germans had named Pheasant Wood.
There was a German document found in 2006 which stated you will dig before Pheasant Wood for 400. So there was no more evasive smoke. The ground had been used for burial purposes. We found a series of aerial photographs of that ground, and before the battle, no digging, then 10 days after the battle, clear evidence of sustained earthwork.
Eventually, the experts not only found the missing diggers just where Lambus and his team said they would be, but they were able to exhume the remains and start identifying them using DNA.
I was invited on site one time to view those remains. It was very graphic, and clearly they were not at rest. I believe you have that moral obligation to find and recover your war dead. You cannot leave them in anonymous dirt.
Today, 2/3 of the 250 missing diggers discovered by Lambus and Glazos and his team in 2008 have been identified by DNA matching, and each year more of them are identified and given headstones where their long-suffering families can visit them and pay their respects.
Identifying one was wonderful, but 166 is sensational, and that process will continue.
There's a lot of symbolism in this room. In a way, the power of people's memories for the people they loved, the people they lost, the reason that this place stands today.
The history of war is usually written by men, but women bear the brunt of grieving that follows every conflict. We came here today to bring a feminine viewpoint to the impact of these battles, and to give a voice to the families who lost so much.
Did your mother ever tell you anything about Nazi?
No, nothing. Sadly, she didn't know anything about her father. We all grew up living next door to Jenny and didn't know that she had remarried, and so we thought her husband was our grandfather. So it wasn't until much later in life that we found out that he actually wasn't, that our real grandfather had been killed in the war.
One of the young diggers who disappeared in the battle was a well-known Sydney Rugby League footballer named Herbert Bolt. Known as Nazi Bolt, he played twice for New South Wales and seemed destined for a glittering career.
After attending Newtown Public School, his career as a rugby player kicked off, and his love for the game was definitely shown in his 52 games, triumph against Queensland twice, all achieved through his dedication between 1912 and 1915. Herbert also married Jenny Hughes, and together they moved to southern Sydney, where they started a family, welcoming a baby girl, Mary Monica, whom Herbert called Little Mona.
If ever a husband you should have, and he this book should see, tell him of our youthful days and kiss him once for me. I think that reality had hit and probably realised that he was in fact going to a deep dark war and wasn't coming home. I'm reading into that he truly loved his wife and wanted her to be happy, and was probably suggesting that if she ever did meet somebody else and was to move on, he wanted her to enjoy her life and at least think of him from time to time. Before this all happened, I had little or no interest at all. Never even gave my great-grandfather a second thought. And I've actually asked that question of a lot of people. Do you even know the name of your great-grandfather? And most people say no. Pretty amazing thing to have been able to build a connection with somebody who passed away such a long time ago. It was a wonderful experience to be involved in everything that happened around Fromelles.
On the morning of the 20th of July at about 5 a.m. at Fuller Bay, he and I were close to one another when we were attacked by the Germans. He got more than 6 of them with his bayonet and the butt of his rifle, when he got a bullet through his head. He fell instantly, being killed outright. He was as game as any man, and was a well-known Newtown football player.
Well, this is Herbert Nazi Bolt. This is my great-grandfather and my mother's grandfather. And this is a shrine, if you like, our reincarnation, so we can pay our respects, which we do quite regularly, especially at Anzac Days and the anniversary of the 20th of July.
How does it feel for both of you having a sense of him always here with you?
Well, for myself, I love it. I think it's just beautiful, and each time I come in and see him, I get quite emotional and rather full of goosebumps. It's just beautiful. I love it.
To me, it gives a real purpose to the home, because if it wasn't for Nutzi, if Nutzi never existed, neither would we, including my mum and myself. So, we do have a hell of a debt of gratitude to our great-grandfather, and it was a small token of our appreciation to try and let his memory live on.
One of the missing diggers would play a key role in confirming that the diggers were still buried in the mass graves where the Germans had left them almost a century earlier.
His name was Harry Willis, and his great-nephew, Tim Whitford, a former soldier himself, became a leading member of Lambis and Glazis' team of history detectives.
I was brought up in the care of my grandmother, and my beautiful grandmother, she was a big part of my life, and I adored her. And I remember one day, Nan asked me what I wanted to do when I grew up. And I said, Nan, I want to be a soldier, I want to be an army man. And the colour just drained out of her face straight away. She said, don't you dare, don't you bloody dare. If you join the army, you'll get killed, you'll disappear like my Uncle Harry. He went off to war and he disappeared. And that moment in that kitchen in Yarram, I'll never ever forget. Growing up, you understood that people could just disappear, and it left a scar, and my grandmother carried that with her for her whole life. In the 2007 non-invasive survey, they found hundreds and hundreds of metallic objects. Most of them were just First World War junk, shrapnel balls, bullets, shell fragments. You'd find that anywhere around Fromelles. But among those objects, they found 2 medallions. Through meticulous research, all of a sudden the owner of that medallion is revealed, and it's Private Harry Willis from Alberton in South Gippsland, Victoria, my grandmother's uncle. And it hit me like a ton of bricks. In 2008, I was there at the site. After 2 days, they found nothing. They dug and they dug and they dug, and there was speculation, but nothing. Then on the 3rd day, they found the first of the diggers, and this overwhelming sense of vindication, I guess, but sadness washed over me. We have left these guys there for 92 years at that stage. We'd left them in a paddock for 92 years, and we didn't have to. And I freely admit I wept.
So what have we learned about the cost of war and the long-term damage that it causes?
The Battle of Fromelles devastated families right across Australia. Lamps were lit and left in windows, places set at dinner tables. The effect of the Battle of Fromelles was devastating to families. The anxiety, the loss and the grief. Through the work of St Clare's, the future of commemoration and remembrance is assured and in useful hands.
And I think after doing this assignment, it's made us realise that the history is real. Like we've met family members of these soldiers, we've heard their stories, and we've got real letters and stuff. It just shows how much more personal and the deeper experience that they've got, and that we don't get from just reading from textbooks.
It sort of made it all very personal, because we weren't just looking at numbers, we were actually looking at a person's life, like their family, what they were doing before they went to the war, and made it a lot more sad.
Of course, I knew like a little bit about World War I, but like everyone else said, I didn't know anything about the Battle of Fromelles and just how many people died and how it was one of the worst nights in Australia's history, yet we don't even learn about it in school.
I really want us to spread the message that we should remember all these soldiers, not just on Anzac Day, but every day we should be thinking about the big impact they had on Australian history. So that's what I really want us to try and achieve with this project.
It's just weird. It's like you know them, like it's like a friend that like you just know but have never seen. It's very strange.
This like project really made me think about like how war has so many effects, and like all these young men were going to war thinking like this is going to be the greatest adventure, like we're going to do this all together, and really it wasn't that, and they had no idea about that.
Now after doing this for almost 2 years, it's just put into perspective like how important each life is and how much of an impact one person can make on other people.
I've always thought like war tragic is important. It's an important part of history. It helps us to like learn more about previous times and learn more about society. And Fromelles has just opened my eyes, I think, a bit more to like the personal side of it and how families were affected and how Australia was affected by the war.
It's so unfair. It's so unfair that he had to die, and he was so young, he was 17, and I just want to be able to kind of, I don't really know the words, I just want to be able to like keep his story and the story of other people who died in the Battle of Fromelles to continue like through generations. Like I want my kids to learn about this and everyone to learn about it because it's so important.